Hey everyone, it's Michael here and welcome back to Maps and More. Today I'm kind of starting a third new series, sort of, going along with my other geography and language based videos. And in this I kind of hope to help explain and talk about many of the sort of current events and geopolitical issues across mainly Europe but also the rest of the world, both kind of historically and in the modern day. Later videos I have planned in this series will kind of talk about things like what the European Union is and what the Cold War was. But the first episode that I'm going to do today is about the war in Ukraine. So this obviously is a very sensitive and difficult topic, and I will try and approach it in a way that is fair and sensitive, but also kind of educational, while also giving voice to those who really are being most affected by it. Obviously, if you have any questions or topics you want me to cover, anything like that, please do get in touch, comment, like the video, and subscribe if you're wanting to watch more of these. This will be a part 1 video, there will be a part 2, so if you're wanting to be updated when that comes up, then do subscribe. So firstly, a quick look at a few facts about the country and about the region. Ukraine is a country in Eastern Europe with a pre-war population of about 43.79 million people, and it covers a land area of 603,700 square kilometers, which makes it the second biggest country in Europe after only Russia. It's bordered by Russia to the east, Belarus to the north, and Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova to the west. The capital and largest city is Kyiv, with some other major cities being Kharkiv, Odessa, and Lviv. Russia, meanwhile, is the largest country in Europe and indeed the world, with a land area of 17.1 million square kilometers and a population of 143.4 million people. The capital is of course Moscow, with some other major cities being St. Petersburg, Novosibirsk, and Kazan. The current war began on 24th of February last year, when Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered hundreds of thousands of Russian troops to invade Ukraine after months of warnings from foreign intelligence services and leaders. This marked a major escalation in what had been a low-lying conflict since 2014 for reasons we'll talk about later, and is now the largest and deadliest armed conflict in Europe since the end of World War II in 1945. Despite offers to help him flee the country, meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has stayed to fight and has since become a global hero and a symbol of resistance against the Russian invasion. Over the course of 12 months following that invasion over a year ago, it's estimated that tens or even potentially hundreds of thousands of both soldiers and civilians have died, cities across Ukraine have been bombarded, destroyed by missiles and artillery, and millions of refugees have fled into the rest of Europe. While I will try and unravel kind of the history, some of the causes and geopolitics of this war in a sensitive but also educational way, it is nevertheless important to just take a moment to recognise the immense human suffering of the millions of ordinary people who've been affected by this. And of course also the incredible strength and bravery of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. While the current war, of course, primarily began with that invasion last February, the conflict as a whole really started in 2014 with the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, which we will go into in a little bit. Firstly though, I want to examine kind of the historical roots and origins of the conflict. This is going to be a part 1 video. There will be a part 2 that talks more about the current situation, how the last year has gone, and what the future looking ahead might be. But in this part 1 video, we're really going to go talking into kind of the historical element, the background and origins of this war, and everything leading up to that day 12 months ago. I also want to talk a bit about how Ukraine has developed as a nation, and how history has come to play a very large part in the ideology of this war. This is particularly important because President Putin's interpretation of Russian and Ukrainian history has played a large role in his decision and motives to launch this war. So we can see how the way that one views history has a real and massive impact on people's lives today. Part of Putin's justification for this war is that he doesn't really believe there's a historical basis for Ukraine's independence and sovereign existence as a nation, but I do want to start kind of going through the details of that and explaining why this is wrong. The first thing maybe to keep in mind is that the modern concept of nation states and kind of a country which represents only the primary ethnic or national group is a concept that has only really been around for about 300 years. I think one of the most major events in developing the nation state in Europe was the French Revolution. Previously France, other countries had really just been the domains and personal kind of owned property of the kings and queens. Following the revolution, there was an understanding that the country is more than that it represents the people, that there's a flag and a national anthem and a national identity that's more important than any individual monarch. So this is the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing is that while Russia and Ukraine do have some common origins in the medieval period, this doesn't mean that they're the same country today. So Spain, Italy, France, for example, all have kind of political, linguistic and cultural origins within the Roman Empire. but no one would possibly suggest that those countries have no right to exist as independent nations, or that one should invade the other. So as I mentioned, Russia and Ukraine having some shared heritage and origins, I'll just go into a bit more detail about that now. Prior to the medieval period, the territory of modern-day Eastern Europe was mostly populated by a mixture of Slavic and Baltic tribes who lived in a very rural, agricultural, and decentralized society, with no real kind of centralized ruling authority aside from the elders of each village and area and tribe. At the time, all Slavs more or less spoke the same language, which linguists refer to as Proto-Slavic. What this means is that the ancestors of today's Poles, Ukrainians, Serbians would all have been able to understand each other, even if they probably still had some regional dialects. Then, in the 9th century, during the height of the Viking Age, a Scandinavian group called the Rus sailed down the many large rivers of Europe, the Volga and the Dnieper particularly, and established a kingdom in the city of Kiev, which of course is today's capital of Ukraine. This confederation of Kievan Rus, as we call it, covered a large part of the territory of modern-day Russia, Belarus and Ukraine, and lasted until the Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe in the 13th century. When the Slavic principalities eventually asserted their independence from the Mongol hordes, the lands of modern-day Ukraine, the southern territories, had been separated and split from the northern Russian principalities. Then around the 16th and 17th centuries, there was a semi-independent Cossack state called the Hetmanate, which could be considered an early version of Ukraine, and some of the Cossack leaders in that time are considered early Ukrainian national heroes. Most of the region, though, at that time was known as Ruthenia, and the extent to which the Cossacks are or were Ukrainian is maybe difficult to say. So eventually the Cossack state was conquered and divided between Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with Lviv being the main city of the Polish part of Ukraine. Western Ukraine remained under Polish rule until the entire of Poland was partitioned by Austria in the late 18th centuries, and was briefly returned to Poland between the two world wars. Central and eastern Ukraine, however, remained part of the Russian Empire until all of Ukraine was incorporated into the Soviet Union in the 20th century. So quickly from some context, most of you probably know the Soviet Union was the 20th century communist empire, really led by Russia, that incorporated or occupied 15 modern-day countries, including Ukraine, but as well as places like Georgia, Estonia, Moldova, and Kazakhstan. The capital of the Soviet Union was Moscow, and Russian language was really imposed on most schools and official institutions in every one of the constituent republics. One important note to put as a bit of context in this is that due to large-scale Russification, both during the Russian Empire and the period of the Soviet Union, millions of people across Ukraine speak Russian as either a first or a second language. The national language of Ukraine is Ukrainian, which is an East Slavic language, somewhat similar to Russian, but with a lot of differences as well. Now, the Russian-speaking population is highest in regions like Crimea and the Donbass, which of course were the regions where Russia kind of began this conflict in 2014. And that's not really a coincidence, since part of Putin's justification sometimes for his aggression, for Russia's war, is under the pretext of supposedly protecting Russian speakers. This maybe makes some other countries nervous, as due to history in the Soviet Union, there are many Russian speakers in other countries such as Estonia, Latvia, Moldova, Kazakhstan, and perhaps if Putin continues to use that rhetoric of protecting Russian speakers from pro-Western governments, then it could be used as justification for other acts of aggression in the future. Nevertheless, Ukraine by this time did already have a fairly strong, fairly well-developed national identity, which was separate to Russia and that of the other Slavic neighbours. It finally gained full independence in 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, of the USSR, and has been slowly moving into kind of democracy, capitalism, and pro-Western liberal values. Russia, however, only really followed this democratic trajectory for a short period in maybe the 1990s. Even then, it was quite complicated, and during the 23 years of Putin's rule has been sliding back into kind of authoritarianism and ultranationalism. NATO, the Western military alliance, which was originally set up as a counter and a rival to the Soviet Union during the period known as the Cold War, became the main target of Putin's resentment, especially when former Soviet countries like Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania joined NATO in 2004. Putin claims that in the early 1990s, Western leaders promised that NATO would never expand eastwards, but there's no way of really verifying that claim, and besides, it's not so much a case of NATO expanding, but rather independent countries freely choosing to join NATO. Ukraine's stated desire since 2014 to join NATO is often cited by the Kremlin as one of their kind of justifications for the current invasion. The idea of Ukraine, which Russian nationalists consider to be historically Russian land anyway, joining an organisation that they see to be an enemy, is not something that Putin and his ideological allies can really accept. Additionally, the chaos and trauma of Russia's economic collapse in the 1990s, combined with their loss of authority in the world stage as a superpower, made it easy for figures like Putin to then blame the West for their troubles and gain popularity by asserting military and geopolitical strength. In some ways, there's a small fragment of truth, and only a small fragment, amongst the propaganda, in that the international community didn't really know what to do with Russia post-Soviet Union and kind of turned a blind eye to the massive corruption and dysfunction that was going on in Yeltsin's government. This maybe gives the impression that the West never really cared that much about what was happening to ordinary Russians during that period. So during this period, Boris Yeltsin often appeared in public kind of drunk, while privately allowing huge corruption, organised crime to take place. Also, many businessmen and oligarchs, such as former Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich, were able to profit from the collapse of Russia's economy by illegally acquiring state assets at almost no cost. That money was then often invested in the West in the following years, and we sort of turned a blind eye to where that had come from. Of course, that doesn't make Russia's actions since then right at all, but it is helpful to maybe understand why the Russian people allowed the authoritarian backsliding under Putin to initially happen. So Putin's use of ultranationalism, combined with military and geopolitical confrontation, first maybe majorly manifested itself in 2008, when there was a short war in two breakaway regions of Georgia, called Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But it really reached a new level in 2014, with Russia's annexation of Crimea. This was, amongst other things, a response to the pro-Western revolution that occurred in Ukraine, which led to the overthrow of Russian-backed President Viktor Yanukovych. The removal of this pro-Russian leader caused some backlash in Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, but primarily happened in Moscow itself, where there was outrage at Ukraine's pivot away from pro-Russian politics to a new kind of liberal pro-Western direction. Amongst the protests and counter-protests kind of during this revolution, Russia used soldiers that were already stationed at their naval bases in Crimea, and particularly in Sevastopol, to quickly take over the entire peninsula and unilaterally declare its union with Russia. At the same time, Russian-backed separatists in the Donbass region, that is the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces of Ukraine, attempted to forcibly break away from Ukraine and started a conflict which killed around 10,000 people over the following 8 years. This conflict slowed down and the front lines became frozen in place for most of that time, but the unstable eastern border and the kind of unofficial independence of those regions remained a problem for Ukraine and something which hampered any kind of development and integration into Western institutions. For years it appeared that this situation suited Russia, and Putin was kind of happy to maintain this frozen local conflict in order to, for example, keep Ukraine out of NATO and the European Union, as well as creating general dysfunction, disagreement, even a bit of corruption within Ukrainian politics. Additionally, Crimea became a de facto part of Russia, even though by international law it was not legal. And in Putin's ultra-nationalist ideology, Crimea became a symbol of the restoration of Russia's historical lands and power. Despite the fact that the status quo appeared to suit all sides, and particularly Russia, this was completely torn up on the 22nd of February last year, when Vladimir Putin officially recognised the independence of the breakaway Donbass region, something which Russia hadn't done previously despite having covertly supported the rebels for 8 years. 2 days later, hundreds of thousands of Russian troops launched a full-scale assault on Ukraine from all sides. This was possible because for almost a year leading up to that day, Russia had been amassing thousands of soldiers, tanks and weapons on the Ukrainian border in preparation for the invasion. While the Western and international community was very aware of this situation, most regional experts and students, including myself and even my university professors, really just thought that this was a bluff and an attempt to intimidate Ukraine into withdrawing their plans to join NATO, officially recognise Crimea's status within Russia, and possibly give up some territory in the Donbass region as well. There was, however, no indication that the Ukrainian government could ever really agree to those demands, and it's probable that Putin plans to invade from the very beginning. So it was then that on 24th of February last year, 2022, Russia's full-scale war of aggression against Ukraine was launched. While Putin hoped and probably almost certainly believed that Ukraine would fall within weeks, a catalogue of systemic failings in the Russian army, combined with the unexpected resistance of Ukraine, as well as large amounts of Western financial and military aid, allowed the defenders to completely defy expectations and push back Russia's initial assault. Now 1 year on, Russia is as far away from taking Kiev and defeating Ukraine as it was then. So in part 2 of this video, I will describe the current situation of the war, kind of how it has unfolded in the last 12 months, and what the future of the conflict in the region may be. Right now, however, I'm going to end this part 1 video here. Thank you all for watching, And I remind you to maybe subscribe and keep an eye out for part 2 when it drops. Until then, take care of yourselves and bye for now.